Okay, so we are live. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for attending tonight's live event, the Recife Cycle in Focus. My name is William Plonick, and I'm the Executive Director of Cine Limite, a nonprofit organization based in New York City with the goal of exhibiting repertory Brazilian cinema and promoting cultural exchange between the United States and Brazil. I'm especially thrilled to be able to moderate tonight's discussion about the Recife Cycle with two of the movement's foremost scholars, Luciana Corrêa de Araújo and Amanda Mansur. But before I introduce Luciana and Amanda, I'd like to issue a few thanks to those who have made tonight possible, provide a brief commentary on the Cinemateca Brasileira, and introduce our event. So tonight's event, the Recife Cycle in Focus, would not be possible without the complete support of the wonderful Cinemateca Pernambucana. The Cinemateca Pernambucana is a space dedicated to the collection, cataloging, preservation, formation, research, and diffusion of productions of the cinema made in Pernambuco. In addition to films, Cinemateca Pernambucana brings together collections such as scripts, posters, production cards, and photographs. Open since 2018, Cinemateca Pernambucana's focus is the active preservation and diffusion of Pernambucan cinema in digital format, with an online collection continuously updated. The Cinemateca Pernambucana's website makes available around 300 movies that are dated from the beginning of the 20th century until today. This event tonight is part of Cine Limite's ongoing program with the Cinemateca Pernambucana, The Story of a Soul, a collection of films from Pernambuco, where we are exhibiting 9 Pernambucan films from the silent era until the 90s, all with new English translations. This program lasts until the end of August, and I encourage anyone watching tonight to check it out. I'd also like to especially thank staff members of the Cinemateca Pernambucana, Ana Farashi, Paulo Cunha, Ingrid Xavier, and Victoria Victor. Before we begin tonight, we would be amiss to not mention the ongoing closure of the Cinemateca Brasileira, Brazil's largest film archive located in Sao Paulo. If this program with the Cinemateca Pernambucana has taught anything, it's that when film archives in Brazil are open, running, funded, and well-staffed, some of the world's best film programming can happen. However, the Cinemateca Brasileira remains closed for well over a year now, and even after the most recent fire at one of the off-warehouse locations of the archive, the government has not made swift action to reinstate the workers of the archive and restore it to some semblance of its original functionality. We stand in solidarity with the workers of the Cinemateca Brasileira, and we hope that this extremely important issue meets its resolution soon. So I'd like to go ahead now and briefly introduce tonight's event and introduce tonight's speakers. Tonight's event, the Recife Cycle in Focus, provides us with the opportunity to speak with two of the topic's foremost scholars. The Recife Cycle refers to a moment in Brazilian cinema history when, in the capital of Pernambuco, Recife, a significant number of movies were produced during the second half of the 1920s. During this period of filmmaking in Recife, at least 12 production companies arose, and according to sources, more than 40 films were shot and commercially exhibited, including shorts and feature films. The Recife Cycle is certainly one of the best preserved and most accessible of the silent era regional cycles that took place in Brazil, with portions of 7 films from the Recife Cycle available on the Cinemateca Pernambucana website. For that reason, tonight's event feels especially prudent. The Ciclo do Recife has been little written about in English up to this point. Luciana has published about the Recife Cycle in the book Stars and Stardom in Brazilian Cinema, and there are a few articles on the internet about this topic. But beyond that, one can say that this very important historical moment has yet to receive its full due in the world of English language cinema studies. And we hope that tonight's event is a step in the right direction in that regard. We're going into tonight's event under the assumption that anyone watching now or in the future has already watched some films of Recife Cycle. And for that reason, we will be avoiding summarizing the films that are under discussion. We will be covering details about the historical context under which these films were made, who the creators were. We'll talk about some of the target audiences and things of that nature. We'll also be exploring the research methods of our guest scholars, who I will now go ahead and introduce. Our first guest to be introduced is Luciana Corrêa de Araújo. Luciana holds a degree in social communication from the Federal University of Pernambuco, a master's degree in cinema from the University of São Paulo, and a doctorate in cinema from the University of São Paulo. Luciana did postdoctoral work at the graduate program in multimedia at the University of Campinas. She is currently an adjunct professor at the Federal University of São Carlos. Luciana has experience in the field of communication with emphasis in cinema, studying mainly the following themes: cinema history, Brazilian cinema, silent cinema, and film criticism. Our second guest to be introduced is Amanda Mansur. Amanda is a professor at the Centro Acadêmico de Agreste of the Universidade Federal de Pernambuco. She has a master's and a PhD from the graduate program in communication at the Federal University of Pernambuco and a postdoctorate at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. Amanda teaches courses, workshops, and mini courses on theory and practice of audiovisual, besides working in the area as a producer, director, and curator. She is the coordinator of Laboratório de Imagem e Som do Agreste, a research group certified by CNPq. She is the author of the books O Novo Ciclo de Cinema em Pernambuco, A Questão do Estilo, which was released by Editora Universitária da UFPE in 2010. A Aventura do Bel Perfumado, released by CEPE in 2016, and Abordagem do Cinema em Pernambuco, released in 2019 by Editora Massangana. Amanda currently serves as Vice Coordinator of Cinema at UFPE and is a member of the Collegiate of Social Communication. Well, with introductions out of the way, I'd like to begin tonight by posing a question to both of our speakers about their personal experiences and connections with the Recife Cycle. I'm wondering if you both can discuss your own personal experiences discovering this very important moment in Pernambucan cinema history. And when did these films become available for you to view? And can you describe your first viewing experiences? And we'll begin with Amanda, and then we'll go to Luciana.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really thank you for the opportunity to speak about the Recife Cycle and the Pernambucan cinema here with you, William, and with Luciana. And about my first experience, for the first time experience to watch the films, I'm not. I remember the first time I saw a film from the Recife Cycle was in Paulo Cunha's class, Brazilian cinema, and he projected A Filha do Advogado. It was the first time, but I want to mention another time that for me it was very special. It was when the Cinemateca Brasileira made a project. I think it was the digitalization of the films, and they showed the films in Teatro Santa Isabel. I think that Luciana can help me with that information because it's been a while, I'm not sure. But it was incredible because they project the movies with live music. And the music was played live, but they made the music. It was not the music that you are listening when we are watching now from the website of Cinemateca Pernambucana, but it was an amazing experience.
Thank you, Amanda. And Luciana, if you also can share your first experiences watching these films.
Well, I believe that the first silent film from Recife I saw was A Filha do Advogado. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say that it was back in the 80s when it was screened at Teatro Santa Isabel. The film was restored back then. And at that time, when I was in college, I tried to interview Jota Soares, but he was already very old and was not very well. And a friend and I, we went to his house, but he apologized and he said, "Well, I'm not well, sorry for that." And after that, when I was thinking about my postdoctorate, I started to research Recife silent cinema, and my first thought was to do film analysis. But then I realized that there were many things yet to be researched. So I prefer to focus my research on newspapers and magazines and other documents in order to know more about this period, to have more information about what have been done regarding the films, the people who were involved, and also the reception, how the films from Recife were promoted in the magazines, in real-based magazines such as Para Todos, Selecta, and Cinearte. And then I discovered a universe to research.
Amanda mentioned the screenings at the Cinemateca Brasileira and that moment when those films were restored using digital tools at that time period. And today, thanks to that period, thanks to the Cinemateca Brasileira, the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco, we have quite good-looking copies, I think, of films like Retribuição, Durando Vingar, A Tareia da Praia, A Filha do Advogado, and Revezes, including other documentary films and fragments. And when we think about silent Brazilian cinema that we have access to today, you always have to wonder about how, in fact, these films were saved, because so much, as we all know, has been lost, and so much of cinema from Brazil from that period has been lost. And I'm wondering if perhaps either of you know any information about how in fact these films that were produced now close to 100 years ago were saved. Of course, we know quite a lot of them were not. Many films were seemingly discarded, but the number that we have is quite exceptional. So it seems that perhaps a person or an institution realized that these films were in fact worth saving. Do either of you perhaps know anything about the journey of these films throughout the decades and how we in fact have these copies today looking so great?
Well, I can say a few words about that. I think that it was not one person or one institution, but rather a combination of persons and institutions and actions. Because I believe that the first action towards preserving the films was made in the 40s, and that was very important because less than 20 years after the films were made, there was already this mentality that they were important and they were important to preserve. So there was a a kind of film club created in Recife called Cine Seri. And the guy who was ahead of this film club, Pedro Salgado Filho, he knew that some of the films from the 20s, in some of them he worked as an actor or doing something else. He knew that some of those films were being were available to buy, and so he bought them. And at this time, he contacted J. Soares, and J. Soares bought A Filha do Advogado's print. And then they screened the films, and they changed the name of the Cine Club to Museu Cinema Museum. And you see that concern about the prints, that concern about the history of cinema in Recife, and that's very important. And then after Pedro Salgado Filho died, the prints went to a department at the mail department, at the city hall department, something like that. And they stayed there until the 60s, until 1960, I believe, when Caio Shelby, a guy who worked at Cinemateca Brasileira, Caio Shelby was in Recife, and he took these prints and brought to São Paulo to restore them, and then send them back. Not to restore, sorry, to make an intermediate negative of them, so to copy them. And then, well, the films went back to J. Soares, and in the early 80s, J. Soares sold his collections of films and other documents to Fundação Joaquim Nabuco.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the early 2000, the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco made an agreement with Cinemateca Brasileira and sent the nitrates, because the films were nitrate print, and sent them to Cinemateca Brasileira to be restored, to be digitally restored. And, and there were other actions, such as the journalist Luiz Maranhão Filho found a film about the medicine school in Recife, who was shot by Edson Chagas. And some other films were found like that. But the major collection, I believe, came from this first action done by Pedro Salgado Filho and J. Soares.
And in addition to what Luciana said, I just want to mention Fernando Spencer, because he was a huge friend of J. Soares, and he told him about, he gave him the idea to sell the films to the Fundação Joaquim Nabuco at that time.
So we just mentioned, and you both helped shed light onto how the films that we do have were in fact preserved to this day, but you both have produced a considerable amount of historiographic research on this period, and to do so, you did not have access to all the films. You had to use secondary sources to paint a larger picture of this entire period of history. And wondering if you both can talk about your research project from sort of when you became interested in the Recife Cycle. If you can talk about the importance that newspaper articles, magazines, journals, photographs, things of that nature had an impact in your research and helping you paint a larger picture of the film movement. And if you also can speak to, perhaps you know, perhaps you're not sure about this, but are these secondary sources also preserved? And where would researchers today go to find them? And I'll begin with you, Amanda, and then Luciana.
Okay. So, do you want to start, Luciana?
Amanda, you can go ahead.
So it's me.
No,
Okay,
that's
so,
right.
My emphasis, my focus on Pernambucan cinema is on contemporary cinema. But I'm always looking for the past, for the Recife Cycle and the first productions here, to understand the way we produce and we make films now. I'm going to talk about my last huge research that was my PhD. My thesis is called A Brodagem no Cinema em Pernambuco. It's a brotherhood in Pernambucan cinema.
You do have a portion of that thesis on the Recife Cycle, of course.
Yes. And it was the first book published by the Cinemateca collection. We now have this Cinemateca collection, and we hope that we could publish a lot of books, and with all these researches that are happening, and really important researches that happened years before. And so the main of my thesis, it was to explain what's different about making films in Pernambuco. And I looking for a past, I found that this event of always during this production, we had groups of people who didn't know anything about making films, people that didn't have any kind of how do I say, formation or information about use the equipments and the techniques, and they decided to make movies because they were a huge fans of cinema, and they were they had this desire to make films, and this was this kind of situation. This starts in Recife Cycle. So I start to read a great work of Lucila Bernardet. She studied o cinema de Pernambucan cinema and the ciclo do Recife. And it's incredible because she interviewed some of these filmmakers and actors and people involved with the Recife Cycle. And it was great for me because I was looking for what kind of relationship these people had, how they knew each other, why they wanted to make films. And I found that this kind of way of making movies were repeatedly were being constantly during the whole history of Pernambucan cinema. And for example, and you just mentioned the papers and the newspapers, and for me it was very important when I found an article that was from 1926 that was published probably for Mauro Mendonça wrote it. And the article is mentions, I'm going to say what the article says because I think it's the definition of Pernambucan cinema, okay? And the article was in 1926. And the article said this. Just a minute. I need to find it and translate.
No,
but
right.
I will be here. Okay, so the article says, because so far there have only been small groups of half a dozen boys in Recife who don't know anything about cinema and who only want to make selfish and intriguing films. this was the first time I know now that definitions about the this group and the Recife Cycle. There were articles before this one, but this one took my attention because I think this is the mark of the Pernambucan cinema for all over 100 years, you know.
Yes, that's very interesting. And Luciana, you yourself have also utilized a lot of secondary resources in your own work, publishing photographs, citing newspapers, articles, magazines. And where have you, how have you been able to conduct that kind of research in your own writings?
Well, first I must say that when we research Brazilian cinema, especially Brazilian silent cinema, secondary sources are our primary sources many times. So it's so important to do that. And there is a long tradition of researchers and scholars who work with newspapers and magazines. For instance, one of the famous book on Brazilian silent cinema, Paulo Emílio Salles Gomes, Humberto Mauro, Cataguases, Cinearte. Well, Cinearte, the magazine, is in the title, right from the title, because it's very important to study both the films, the production environment, and also the press, the magazines. So I always do this kind of research, and for many years now, we have this wonderful database, which is Hemeroteca Digital, from the Biblioteca Nacional, the National Library. It's amazing. Many newspapers and magazines digitized, and but still there are many periodicals yet to be digitized, and in them we can find a huge amount of new information or new approaches, and to investigate. For instance, in the case of Recife, studying the silent period, an important newspaper like the Jornal do Comércio is not yet digitized. And it's very important, not only in terms of film production, but also in film criticism. Because in the late 1920s, there was, I can say, I believe it was the first generation of film critics in Recife. And they wrote in Jornal do Comércio, also in A Província and Diário de Pernambuco. A Província and Diário de Pernambuco are both digitized, but not the other ones. About other archives, of course, Cinemateca Brasileira. And in Cinemateca Brasileira, there is a very important collection from film critic Pedro Lima. And this collection is divided between Cinemateca Brasileira and Arquivo da Cidade do Rio de Janeiro, in Rio. This collection is amazing because it holds many press clips, but also many letters. Because Pedro Lima and Ademar Gonzaga were journalists that wrote in Selecta, Para Todos, and Cinearte magazine, and they exchanged letters with everyone who was doing something in cinema back in the 20s. So it's an amazing collection. Also, the collection at Cinédia, which holds the Ademar Gonzaga collection with, again, many letters, many documents, many press clips. So there are many things yet to be researched. And I hope Well, Amanda has some news to tell us. I don't know if it's a secret, Amanda, but you can say.
Okay.
So in the archives, we can find important documents. In the Pedro Lima archive, for instance, I found an envelope called the Aurora's case, quite a police case, with many documents, including I don't know how to say that in English. Livro caixa, the book where you write down all the expenses and the profits that the company has had. So, and those documents are fantastic, and the letters as well.
It's incredible, and hopefully that can be digitized soon as well, and people have access to that kind of material. I want to turn our conversation now. Go ahead. Go ahead, Amanda.
Just to say about the news. No, it's that we are always changing the date and the facts, because we are each year we find new documents that were somewhere that we didn't know. And there are two important archives here. One is Arquivo Público, the Public Archive of Pernambuco, and there are recently I'm writing an article with a researcher called Felipe Davidson, and he has a great research on Pernambucan cinema before the Recife Cycle and the first projection here, and that he's making. He made an amazing work in his on his master thesis, and about a month or 2 months ago, a friend of him that is helping with the research, because he's living in Rio de Janeiro now, and he was looking for documents in the archive, and he found the document that they asked for the foundation of the Aurora film. They asked for found the Aurora films, and it was a document that it was never seen before. So sometimes this happens. No, it happens a lot, because we still have the as we were talking before, Luciana, the privilege to have the documents, and they are not all digital yet.
It's quite the discovery, absolutely, and how exciting to be talking about something that clearly is still so living, and clearly has so much for us to learn more about, and that is quite incredible. And thank you for sharing the secret with everyone here tonight, Amanda. I want to turn our conversation towards the Recife Cycle, and really what was going on a bit prior to the Recife Cycle. Many people, when writing about this period of time, have discussed it through the lens of the clashing between modernity and traditionalism in Recife at that moment. And of course, cinema would be a very obvious sign of modernity within that discussion. But for people watching these films and hearing about this kind of convergence, I think we'd be curious to know more about really what Recife was like 20 years maybe before the Recife Cycle began, at the dawn of the 20th century. We know some things that, for example, a lot of the films in Recife Cycle are dealing with the status of Pernambuco or Recife becoming a little bit lower than Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo in entrepreneurship and business and things of that nature. But that really does beg the question, what was Recife like at maybe, let's say, its golden age, about prior to that? And how should we imagine this capital if we were thinking about it, or if you're framing it as a reference for people? And I'll leave that as an open question for both of you.
Can I start, Amanda? Okay. Well, Recife is a very cosmopolitan city, and that has to do with its history and also with the harbor. The harbor is a key element in Recife because through the harbor it was possible to all the circulation in the city, and it backs to the 17th century and all, and also it backs to the 17th century all social inequalities in the city, and a very conservative view as well. And I think that the films from the 20s, they deal exactly with that combination of modernity, cosmopolitanism, and traditional conservative values. Because cinema was quite a modern thing, and all those guys and girls, they were excited to work with cinema and to be part of that modernity. But we also see in the films all that the traditional values when it comes to classes, when it comes to the role of women, when it comes to how Black people are depicted, and so on. So it's a very interesting and contradictory combination that we see there. And as for the history of Recife, I'm not a specialist on that, but I think that I also researched the 50s when Alberto Cavalcanti was in the city filming O Canto do Mar. And both in the 20s and in the 50s, I see a kind of nostalgia of a time when Recife was more prominent in the national scenario. So this kind of effort to bring Recife back to its golden days, it's a constant thing. I don't know exactly which golden days were that. Don't ask me that. But this nostalgia always is always there. I don't think I answered that, but we can go on with other topics if you want.
No,
Amanda, is there anything you'd like to add to it?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this utopia and the nostalgic relation. I want to share with you this book. It's Paulo Cunha's book. It's about the Recife representation, how the film, this film production was concerned in showing Recife as a border city when they were living this period of decadence, and it's interesting because it was a kind. Paulo says that it was a kind of dream. So they dreamed that Recife was a modern city, and they dreamed that adopted the city as a way of life. The city was the theme of the Recife Cycle, and the melodrama, the way of being. But it's also interesting, as Luciana said, that the society, it was really archaic and moralist, and we can. But in the films, most of the women, they are buying things alone, or they are driving alone. They don't need the men, but behind the scenes, the situation was really different here. And it's also interesting how Recife, that was a city in the periphery of America, and it was the same size of other cities, but the harbor, as Luciana said, it was really important because it was how the cameras came to Recife, how the people from other countries came with this for film the city too. And it's that. Okay, it's
No, I
very.
think
I would like to add something. Just as Amanda said, the city of Recife is central in the films, even in the films that wanted to sell this image of regional, like Jurando Vingar, who takes place in the sugarcane plantations, or Aitaré da Praia, with the beach and the fisherman village and the jangadas and so on. But all of them, well, not all of them, because Reveses and Sangue de Irmão, they are not Recife-centered, but the others were, if we, for instance, Jurando Vingar, it takes place mostly in the countryside. It's a long flashback, and we can say that Recife frames this flashback because the protagonist goes to Recife, he meets a friend, and he tells his friend what's happened. And one of the first intertitles, not the first intertitles are patriotic but the first intertitle regarding the plot says, Recife, the beautiful metropolis of Pernambuco, where everyone wants to live, where everyone wants to live. I love that intertitle. That's perfect, because that no matter how the films try to depict other landscapes or other places, most of them wanted to underscore how Recife was modern and a wonderful city to live in. Even Aitaré, because Aitaré is a fisherman, but then he moves to the city, to Recife. And all the idea of the film is that change is necessary for Aitaré to forget his past, his uncivilized past. So that's very interesting to see that even in the most regional plots, the most regional approach, the city is always very important.
So at the end of Amanda's response, she mentioned the ports and how through the ports film came to Recife. And it very much poses the question of what was cinema culture like in Recife, because figures such as Ugo Falangola and Jota Cambieri, J. Cambieri, obviously did not bring film to Recife. They built upon, in a way, what was there. So I don't know this history perfect, but presumably certainly American cinema between the years 1900 and 1920 had made its way to Recife. And there must have been some kind of cinema culture that allowed filmmakers, well, immigrant filmmakers, but people who are living in Recife to want to make national films. So can either of you talk about what was cinema culture like in Recife when it first got there? Perhaps there are some major distributors who are historically important, maybe some theaters. What was that culture like that allowed these these people to think we can make an investment in film and, you know, actually be successful at this.
Luciana, can I start? Because I'm not going to talk about.
Amanda, please go ahead.
Okay, the cinema arrived in Pernambuco only a few months after the first projections of the Lumiere brothers in Paris. So the first projection in Pernambuco, it was on 13 September of 1896. And it was an actor. His name was Francisco Pereira de Lira. And he was also a producer of popular shows. And he traveled to Paris and he brought this kinetographer and started to make to project films here. But the start of the production, because you know that we can discuss this date. You know, the historians usually to think about and to establish it. I don't know how to say it, but this date of the Recife Cycle, it was between 1923 and 1931. But we know now that the production of films here started in 1910. And then 1916 with the Cine Jornal, the first edition, and then 1917 with the second edition. But now, go, Luciano, with this information, because you are the expert on it.
But after that, the exhibition market grew very much. So cinema already in the 10s and in the 20s was already a very important entertainment in the city. And there were many movie theaters, and Recife was a key city regarding distribution, because films arrived in Recife to be sent to other cities and states. So Recife was the point of depart of films in the Northeast. There was Salvador, but Salvador was another case. So the films arrived in Recife, and then they were distributed. There were many movie theaters. The main exhibition chain was Severiano Ribeiro, a company that started in Ceará, in Fortaleza. But I guess I think that's another field to be explored: distribution and exhibition in Recife. I believe that in the 20s, the movie theaters were more, how can I say, autonomous. Maybe Joaquim Matos, who run Cinema Royal, the movie theater in which all the Aurora films were screened. Maybe Joaquim Matos had more freedom in the mid-20s to program films from Recife. After 1927, he will not program any more films produced in Recife. And I guess it was because the Royal was part of the Severiano Ribeiro chain. And I think that it was more difficult to program films apart from the company's directions. But so and people involved in film production, they had access to films, to many films, most of them American films. But especially regarding Hugo Falangola, I believe we have to mention that he was Italian, and he lived in Italy for a while, and he was living there when the First World War started, and he came back to Italy. So I see things from European cinema in Venice Americana, the film American Venice, and in his other works. He was very careful with the shooting, with the image, the framing. Their work, his and J. Cambier, with colors is amazing. So and also Falangola worked with painting and gravura. I don't know how to say that in English, but he had that background related to the fine arts, or not so fine arts, popular arts, and then I think the influence of European cinema on him was strong. Also, I think when it comes to Ari Severo, another one that directed and also starred in some films, he studied in France in the early 20s. And when I see a film like Jurando Vingar, I think, which was directed by Ari Severo, I think that there is a strong connection with European cinema, with European decoupage, the way he works with deep focus, not exactly staging in depth, but he explores that. The shots are a bit longer than in the American classic language. So, but most of them, they were completely American film fans. They admire very much Hollywood, and they were not cinephiles. They were fans, and they were excited to be part of that Cinelandia, that Cineland, working, doing films, as well as, and not only watching them.
On that topic, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Well, I was going to ask.
Say that, regarding the film exhibition, the majority of films were American in the movie theaters. The majority of them were American, and as it is today.
So it's interesting. I was going to ask about cinephilia, because it almost sounded like you were describing a kind of cinephilia. And you've, of course, Luciana, you've written about fandom essentially being an important factor going on at this period. And another question that comes up for me when I look at all of these names, Gentilhóis, Ari Severo, excuse my pronunciation, Chagas Ribeiro, Jota Soares, and Edson Chagas, so many figures, and I wonder, are there any records of maybe cine clubs or meetup places for filmmakers and film technicians? Because, and I'd like to follow the question about cine clubs. I've been wondering about how one becomes a film professional in Recife in the 1920s. And it sounds like it's first they were fans and then they started to experiment. So was there a kind of a culture that we can think about here, a movement of people coming together, or is this sort of more isolated?
I believe that if we think about the group involved in film production, they were mostly fans and also very interested in the technical part of cinema. The technical part attracted many of them, like Edson Chagas. I don't think Edson Chagas was a huge fan of films, but he was a really good professional. He was a cameraman, he directed, and he was the major figure in Recife silent cinema from the 20s. I guess, in my view, we will find something more close to cinephilia towards the end of the decade, as I said, when film critics were they were interested in films, but not only in films and stars, but also in directors, in screenwriters. And there's this very important film critic at the moment who was Evaldo Coutinho, who then would write a book on cinema, a philosophical book on cinema. And Evaldo Coutinho, his brother Aloísio, was from the Chaplin Club, one of the first film clubs in Brazil. So his brother Aloísio lived in Rio because he was studying medicine and was part of the Chaplin Club and wrote to Fun, the periodical of the film club. So and when you read Evaldo Coutinho's reviews, he's always very concerned about language, style, about the other relating with other previous works from the screenwriter and the director. And also he wrote about Russian films and how different they were from American films and their contribution to cinema language. So all this concern about language and about the directors and authors, as we would call decades after that, I think it's more strong towards the end of the decade.
Amanda, is it possible that your concept of brodagem, which I think would loosely translate to brotherhood, but don't take my word on that. Perhaps, would you be able to explain how that concept would allow us to think about the coming together of these filmmakers or the uniting of them? So if indeed we don't have a cinephilia here,
yeah,
but we do perhaps have the sing of brodagem. How does that perhaps help us understand a bit more about how these people came together and professionalized themselves as film workers?
Okay. So behind the brodagem concept, because I wrote this thesis and is using brodagem, the concept as a social theoretic concept. So it's I should have more time for this, but I'm going to use an example of the Recife Cycle and how the people joined the group using the example of Jota Soares. For example, Jota Soares, he was not born in Recife. He was born in Propiá, in the countryside of Sergipe State. And his family owned a movie theater. And so since he was a kid, he started to watch films. And then he went his family sent him to Recife for studying, for transforming, because Recife was the city that you could transform yourself in something better. And he
almost.
And he started working in commerce as a merchant, something like this. And one day he was walking and saw a Creole filming. And when he saw that, he went there and introduced himself, and he started the relationship, and then he was making films. But this concept of brodagem, it means it's a way of making films that there are not only positive things about brodagem. It's important to mention that, but as what happens here, as they couldn't, the individual alone, they couldn't produce their films alone. They joined a group so they could film all the films of everybody that joined the groups, doing this together, you know.
And these figures were not upper class. For example, these filmmakers did not come from very wealthy backgrounds. Can you also maybe mention, why that would be? I mean, of course, if it's an extremely wealthy individual, it might be a possibility to foresee someone buying a camera, buying the film footage. Mm-hmm. But in this case, brodagem, when these figures do need each other to produce this kind of work, perhaps that also very much applies and relates to the concept. Can you also talk about the background of these filmmakers and maybe where they came from and why they needed each other so much?
Luciana, if you want to.
Okay. First, I'd like to say that I'm pretty sure that we can see J. Soares in Veneza Americana. When some politicians arrive in the harbor and there's a pan of the military band, and a guy goes following the camera and looking at the camera, a very skinny guy. And it's J. Soares. So his interest in cinema, I guess it was already there, registered. It's very interesting. Yes, they were not from the elite. Most of them were middle class people, or low middle class maybe, and they didn't have money, so they tried to start making films with what was available. For instance, buying a second-hand camera, or using that camera also to copy films. And they tried as well to find not rich people, but men who had some money to invest on cinema. I think that the first film, Retribuição, I think the first one from Aurora Film, the film production company, I believe it was their money, their savings. They shot the film with their savings. But after that, they had a partner called, let me see his name, Joaquim do Nascimento Tavares, who was a partner along with Gentil Ruiz and Edson Chagas in Aurora Film. And this was in 1925. In 1926, Aurora Film had another investor, João Pedrosa da Fonseca, who had a shop downtown Recife. Other film companies, they were financed by people with some money. For instance, Planeta Film, the owner of the production company, was the father of one of the actors. The others, such as Olinda Film, the partners were from they work in the press. So they tried many forms to make films, and also there was. But I think, to my view, the great problem was professionalization. To be a professional, to make a living from cinema, and that was the main difficulty they faced. I think that just only Edson Chagas he was the only one to make a living from cinema. He worked as a cameraman, a producer, a director, and he did anything. He was, as we say, a cavador. He was from cavação. He dig every opportunity to make films. So he directed or filmed fiction films, non-fiction films, films about politicians, films about football, films about the medical school, everything. Films about the audience leaving a movie theater that was a subgenre, almost a subgenre, fantastic. So he did anything, and he was, I guess, the only one. The others, they worked in cinema for a while, but then they abandoned because it was not possible to live with as a filmmaker, as a film technician. And sorry to be talking a lot about that, but it's interesting to see that in 1926 they reached this phase of more. They were more professional in 1926 with João Pedrosa da Fonseca, because João Pedrosa da Fonseca, he worked as a producer. He discussed the films. He was more present in the Aurora film. But then after that is the first crisis in film production, because I guess all the money invested in the films, they didn't have a return. It was not profitable to invest in movies, and that's the problem. And then you have after 1926, they are back to produce films with their savings. Well, exception. There was one exception. There was a guy named Manuel, I forgot his name, who produced some films, and he hired Edson Chagas to shoot and direct a film about Jaú, the plane that hydroplane, seaplane that arrived in Recife. But if we look closely, after 1927, it was already very difficult to make films in Recife. So the sound cinema was a huge problem, a huge difficulty, but it was not the only one. Sorry, I talked too much.
No, it's. I think it leads well into the topic of documentary versus fiction films that we see in the Recife Cycle. People have discussed that far fewer non-fiction films exist for us to watch, considered to be less artistic, maybe less historically valuable. But as you just mentioned, what's so interesting here is that these filmmakers began to really see themselves as professionals, and there was the need to make money doing this. What's so striking in a film like Veneza Americana is that, of course, it has this artistic freedom, but it is clearly a work of propaganda in many ways, promoting the city, the capital Recife, to all of Brazil and trying to elevate its status. And this very much makes me wonder a bit about fiction versus nonfiction and profitability of these films. And it seems that these filmmakers very much embraced all of the opportunities they could to film when they could film, and that government officials, that maybe someone very wealthy with a big boat or a big company. Of course, we see in Veneza Americana the flaunting of the politicians, but equally the flaunting of corporations, essentially, and the success of corporations. So why were documentary films, and well, maybe we won't call them documentary films, I believe they're referred to as films naturais, so natural films. Why were these films so important for these filmmakers? And were these films the means by which they then could go and make a film like Ai Teresa Praia, that they then could go make a fictional film like A Filha do Abogado? Were the documentary films the profitability for the filmmakers that allowed them to then go make fiction? Or was it always essentially a risky practice, a risky investment, and a tough business for these filmmakers? A long question. Amanda, if you have anything to say, okay, so Luciana, please go ahead.
Many things. I guess that most production companies, they produced both fiction and non-fiction films. And you are right. I don't like to use the term documentary. And they are connected in many aspects. They are connected financially because non-fiction films, they earn money, not to make fiction films, but to live, that to be professionals of cinema. And also, they were very important because some, how can I say that, fiction films sometimes were embarrassing in the sense that they were not as good as American films. But non-fiction films, they were most of the time valued. I mean, in Recife, they were valued because they depicted the city, its riches and its modernity. That of course was not the case of journalists Ademar Gonzaga and Pedro Lima in Rio. They abominated non-fiction films, naturais, and their campaign for Brazilian cinema excluded filmes naturais, excluded non-fiction films. But what can I see in Recife when the films, the reception of the films is that non-fiction films were valued. Yes, they were, and also they had the stamp of the government. Most of them, not most of them, but many of them were produced by the government. There was this state governor called Sérgio Loreto, and he was in power from 1922 to 1926, and that's no coincidence that it's the same time as the film production in Recife was more vibrant, 1925, 1926, because Sérgio Loreto, not him, his government, and also his, especially his son-in-law called Amaury de Medeiros. Amaury de Medeiros was very concerned and very interested in publicity, in propaganda, to use propaganda in the government. And films were part of all that. So Pernambucan film was financed by the government in Veneza Americana, Recife na Exposição de 1924, Recife na Confederação do Equador, and also Aurora Film, who is known for their fiction films. They produced non-fiction films as well. And in the Lucila Bernardet monography about this period, she says that Gentil Ruiz was friends with Amaury de Medeiros. So you see many connections between them. Another thing, this combination, this contamination between non-fiction films and fiction films, when you see fiction films, they always have scenes which are kind of documentary, which have I don't know if I can say that, a documentary flavor. And these scenes, these shots were very attractive. They were an attraction of the film. For instance, you see Retribuição, the first film. There is this sensational plot, very American, but then you spot streets of the city. You can see the zoo, Dois Irmãos Zoo. You can see places of the city, and that was fascinating for local audience. So I guess that I think that we cannot divide, we cannot separate fiction and non-fiction. They are combined in this period.
And there's certainly, you could talk about maybe semi-fictional moments, perhaps, in the nonfiction. In Veneza Americana, when they're at the carnival, and the filmmaker takes the camera on all the rides, for example. Maybe something staged a bit for the camera, maybe something equally spontaneous, but perhaps you can say that they blend into each other in some ways.
Yeah, that seems amazing. I love that. It's fantastic. And again, that kind of approach reminds me of early films. For instance, the films produced in Paris in the turn of the century by the Lumière and by Edison, how the films explored the mechanics, the new technology, the new devices that appeared back then. And in Veneza Americana, it's wonderful because it's a metalinguistic thing, because the intertitle says that the operator, the cameraman, was so excited that he wanted to go take the rides. I don't know, go in the rides, and the camera captures all the sensation and the movement and the speed of the rides, and you have as an effect many interesting and attractive shots. For instance, in the roda gigante.
It's like a merry-go-round.
The wheel,
the Ferris wheel.
Yes, and when the camera goes down, and you see many
faces,
depth of field changing during the movement, and then the cameraman gets so crazy that when he's out of the rides, everything goes very fast. Everyone walks very fast. And for me, it's amazing, this film, because the film combines such inventive moments. Also, there is a wonderful shot that starts in framing the people inside a streetcar, and then the camera moves back. It's amazing.
Yes.
So the film combines those moments with others that are so boring. They are not so boring because the color is very good. But then after this sequence, in the amusement park, comes a parade with cows and bulls. So
it's a change of pace.
I think that encapsulates the filmes naturais, the filmes de cavação. You have the best, the most inventive things, and also the most traditional. And you have to sell things. You have to act according to the people who put money in the film.
And we're speaking about technical elements, and I want to kind of stay on that topic. One of the things that I wanted to discuss with both of you are the intertitles that we see in the films, as well as the tinting. But depending on how much we know, we can just stick with the intertitles. And I took some screenshots. Because I think it sort of will help us visualize a bit what we're talking about here. And this is something equivocal in the Recife Cycle, and that is incredible intertitles. We notice in every film that either they're just extremely intricate, as we see in this image. I don't know if that's a Capitol building, but of course see boats. We see the crates from the harbor. We have very gorgeous fonts and stylings, the palm beaches, a ton of nuance, the lighthouse with the lettering, and of course just gorgeous fonting, gorgeous intricacies here. But beyond the beauty of these intertitles, they're thematically relevant. I don't recollect which film this one's from, but in this film, it's all about someone getting rejected and being heartbroken. Here, this is from the lawyer, the daughter of the lawyer, a filha do advogado, and this is from the final courthouse scene. And they, of course, make this beautiful drawing here of the woman looking at the judge. These from Aiteira da Praia, of the beach that they're on, and there's, I believe, a few of these that are just extremely evocative. And this is as well from Aiteira da Praia, when towards the end of the film, when they move to the city, the intertitles correspond. And I'm not sure if we have so much to say about this, but it strikes me as a real reflection of the commitment to technical excellence, great artistry, but also really understanding what would draw people to the cinema, and using these as, seeing these on a big screen and them being very beautiful, but also these correlating to the narrative seems to me like just excellent filmmaking, and shows that these filmmakers, as we've discussed, really moved from amateurs to professionals very quickly. And perhaps Amanda or Luciana, perhaps either of you can, I believe you might know of like who was doing these intertitles, but perhaps maybe beyond that, you can talk about your thoughts on the intertitles and the roles that they played in these films. And Amanda, would you like to start?
Okay, I'm just going to start because I'm just going to say who is behind the intertitles. That's a guy named Fininha. It was, and he was a graphic artist. He works with caricatures and works in a graphic. And Luciana can continue by that because I'm learning a lot with Luciana today.
Now, just to say that there is a person researching the intertitles, and Fininha is Larissa Oliveira. I had an article that she wrote. I don't know if there's longer works, but that's really interesting. And I think that it shows, as you were saying, William, shows how devoted they were to make films as the Hollywood model. Let's make those films, and let's explore all the dimensions of film, and not only how to film or how to frame, but also these graphic elements, which were very, very important. And I guess also, I don't know, that occurred to me now, maybe those drawings may also balance some lack of information of the plots, some problems of the narrative, and so not only the words, the intertitles, have that effort to communicate sometimes more than the image when the image doesn't communicate enough, but also the drawings give something else to pay attention to. And they also tell the story. So that it's very important. And regarding Veneza Americana, the vignettes with the kid, Dona Adriana Falangola, who was the daughter of Hugo Falangola, again, I think it goes back to European films from the beginning of the century, to trick films, and the way he plays with that, shooting in reverse and then projecting the image with the girl hanging the letters, and it's another attraction to the film. They work. We are talking about the 20s, but there's still it's still very important, the attractions, some particular elements that they know will seduce, will delight the audience. I think it's very important.
So
And
beyond
about the intertitles in Veneza Americana, I'm very curious to know who wrote them, because the producers were immigrants, and I'm sure they weren't able to write those huge, those long texts, and very difficult. And there's one of the intertitles they use. You can read the Latin saying, res non verba. I don't know how to pronounce that in Latin, sorry. And it means the thing, not the verb. And it's so funny because all you can see is verb, words all the time in the intertitles. But, and just remember one thing. Veneza Americana is really a combination of two films produced by Pernambucan Film, and a way to see one which part comes from which film is from the intertitles, I guess. So this intertitle with res non verba, I guess, comes from a film called Pernambuco na Confederação do Equador. So we can examine, we can distinguish some parts of the film. That's another function of the intertitle today.
Well, we're speaking of the artistry in the films, and one thing that also I think can't be denied is that, at least in certain instances of the fictional works especially, they employ really fascinating modern techniques to convey the psychological states of their characters. And there's a couple quite easy ones to bring up. When the father is on his deathbed in the beginning of Pernambucan, right as he reaches up, you get a quick cut to the image of Jesus right before he dies. We have Corrêa on the cart leaving the beach area to go to the city, and right as she's leaving, we have fast jump cuts to all of her memories with Aitare on the beach and things of that nature. And it seems really fascinating to me that these filmmakers clearly have a good understanding of what techniques evoke the psychological states of their characters. And perhaps it's the case that the influence of American cinema may have had an impact on that, but you also can't take away that I think these are just filmmakers that are working a lot and learning very quickly. And with each subsequent film, we see new techniques, we see dissolves, we see various means of expanding the story beyond just a still camera and a kind of theatrical setting. So I wanted to talk about that, the editing and how it often feels very modern. And I also wanted to ask you both about the use of flashback sequences. Flashback is in a lot of these films. And of course, I think flashback, when we teach it, when it's taught in cinema studies, we see it a lot in like film noir and talking about memory and the psyche. And that's often related to the United States at that period. But my question really is perhaps the use of flashback sequences as such a prevalent narrative element in these films relates to something going on in Recife, in Brazil, in Pernambucan perhaps, that maybe deals with this topic we brought up of modernity versus tradition, looking backwards and looking back at the past and reflecting on those moments. So can either of you comment on both on either the techniques of editing that we see and the increasingly modern editing techniques and the uses of flashback in the films and maybe what that means and what that tells us about this period of filmmaking?
About editing, I think that we must be a bit careful because of the prints we have today. Not all of them are complete, far from that, including Aitare da Praia. It doesn't have the ending. And I don't know if those prints, those nitrate prints, were submitted to some kind of intervention because they've been around many decades. For instance, it was very interesting that you mentioned that montage in Aitare da Praia when Cora remembers when she and Aitare, because there is another montage in A Filha do Advogado towards the end of it, when you see short scenes edited in a very fast pace, and I don't know, it doesn't seem to me something of the time. And I wonder if Jota Soares at some point edited the film. I'm not sure. It's a hint. I don't know. I would have to examine the film, the print to check that. But in terms of flashback, your opinion, William, was so interesting and deep, and I don't have anything as good to say because In my opinion, flashbacks are some elements of this gallery of things to do that they were thrilled to use in the films. So flashbacks. In Retribuição, there are 2 flashbacks about the same scene, about the same action. So you can almost feel the excitement of their excitement to do things like that. So as well as flashbacks, the fights, the chase. So they were really fans of serials in American serials, and we can see that very clear. Not only them, but many filmmakers in Brazil at the time, and we can see it very clear the way they love fight scenes, kidnapping, chasing, all that are very exciting to them. J. Soares, when he writes about Retribuição, he writes something like that. Oh, it was a delicious film. Boats, chasing. You can see the happiness they had with that.
Amanda, is there anything you'd like to add about editing or flashbacks in these films? No? Okay, so we're gearing towards the end of the conversation, and I wanted to talk about the concept of cycle, which in the available references in English about the Recife Cycle, scholars have mentioned that it's a problematic term, but have kind of left it there, that the idea of cycle is problematic, but maybe that's not the point of the article. But and I'd like to maybe get to the bottom of this here and pose the question to both of you if you have any thoughts on the term Recife Cycle. Of course, cycle maybe refers to a seasonal filming when it starts and stops. Why might that term be problematic? And maybe I'll even go a step further and I'll say, if either of you think Recife Cycle might not be the correct way to think about it, what would be a better way?
Well, I think the term Recife Cycle is very useful. It's a very useful label in many ways to sell it to reinforce the tradition of cinema, and it's important. But I think that in terms of historiographic, in terms of writing history, is a limited term. Because I think the word cycle, it isolates periods, and it casts some shadow on other periods, other experiences, other careers. In general, when we see the history of Brazilian cinema, the cycles have to do with fiction films. And we know that was not the reality of Brazilian cinema. Non-fiction films were dominated the production, and then I think that we should look to other topics, and as well as exhibition, distribution, film criticism, and for instance, when you talk too much about cycles, you ignore some experiences which were continuous. An example is in Recife cinema is a cameraman called Firmo Neto. he worked from the late 1930s up to the 1990s as a cameraman, as a director. He founded or was involved with many production companies. He was a teacher as well. So look at this career. It's not a cycle. And he covered many cycles in Recife cinema. But it's wonderful to see that recently many works, many researchers are investigating other topics and are escaping from this jail, I guess, of the cycle. And I wanted to mention some of them, and I apologize because I will forget many. But Amanda already mentioned Felipe Davison and his research on the first decades of cinema in Recife about exhibition, reception. Also, Rodrigo Almeida, who has a film in the program. And other approaches, for instance, the journalist André Dib recently launched a book with film criticism from the 1920s to the 1940s. Other works coming to the 50s and 60s. Oh, that's it. The 60s and the 50s and 60s. Arthur Lira is researching films produced by Instituto Joaquim Nabuco, or Igor Calado wrote about one important thing that happened in Recife, the Foto Cine Clube, an association of amateur filmmakers, and so on. So I think I'm glad to see that the use of the word cycle is not preventing new researchers to explore other topics.
That's amazing, Luciana, and I agree with you. And I think I'm the last person that used the name cycle on a book. And all the time people ask me, and what do you think, that the film production in Pernambuco is going to end because of the technology again? I don't know. And another book that I want to mention is this one. It's the documentary in Pernambuco on the 20th century. It's by Alexandre Figueiredo and Claudio Bezerra, and it shows that another films were being made during all these periods, not only during the cycles, because we have another. We just don't have the Recife Cycle, but we also have the Super 8 cycle. You know,
Movimentos.
Yeah. The era Super 8 era. We can call it like.
Well, we're talking about kind of expanding historiography, and I'd like to conclude on that note with kind of a question I'm not sure about. So I'd like to know from either of you, which is, do you see the legacy of any of these films from Recife Cycle in contemporary Pernambucan cinema? And if so, if so, where might you see that? And how do you think filmmakers today, if any, are thinking about these films and incorporating maybe something about them, a trace, an image, a memory into their own work? And I'll start with Amanda, because I know, Amanda, your focus is contemporary cinema. So perhaps you've seen some of that.
What I see on the contemporary cinema that comes from the Recife Cycle is the Recife is still working as the theme of the films, you know, as the scenery, as of course there is a different approach of the city, and different approaches, because we have more than 3 different generations producing films now, and they have different backgrounds, so they style and the themes are are totally different. How they present, how they show the city, and what are their interests in showing Recife. But another thing is that I forget what I was thinking at first. But go, Luciana, and then I will follow you.
We'll come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, at the risk of sound rather obvious, but I think one of the things is the way the films address Recife, the city of Recife. For instance, one of the things that I love in A Filha do Advogado is how the city penetrates the plot, how the movement of the streets invades the plot and what's happening with the characters. So the streets, the streetcars, the facade of the Royal Cinema, the harbor, many things. And when I see a film like Amarelo Manga, directed by Claudio Assis, there is also that concern about the everyday, the movement of the city. And many times the film Amarelo Manga, many times the film stop to show what's happening in the streets. So I think they are very similar in that point. And I guess that films made recently, although I'm not a specialist in contemporary cinema, so no, it's Amanda, contemporary. But I think one thing is about the town, about Recife.
And I remember. Okay, so one of these style characteristics, style marks that I can see in all the Pernambucan film production, it's what I call auto reference. Because all the during this film production, they are always addressing films that were made before, or addressing the friends, this brotherhood feeling. They are always addressing the history of the Pernambucan cinema. So we can see that in, for example, Baile Perfumado, the Perfumed Ball by Lírio Ferreira and Paulo Caldas. The main character, that is Lampião, he goes to the movies and see A Filha do Advogado. So there are different strategies that they use for showing or for addressing this out reference. But it's one of those. Or in Claudio Assis, that always appears in his own movies and in Lírio's movies too. So they are, so I'm going to I remember that scene that happens in A Filha do Advogado, when Lúcio, the journalist, he's waiting for the tramway, and a guy come on the street and say, "Hey, oh, that's great! Your articles are making a revolution," and it's so it's it is literally brodagem, and it happens in all Pernambucan film production for the past years. No.
Well, I think that's a really, really great place to put a footnote at the end of this conversation. I very much want to thank both of you, Luciana and Amanda, for your participation. And I'm wondering, maybe either of you have just some final thoughts to share, a final idea or a final statement to make regarding this conversation, or regarding the cinema of the Recife Cycle. We could start. Amanda, do you have a final maybe idea to share? Or okay, Luciana, go ahead.
Well, first I'd like to thank you, William, for the invitation. It was great, this conversation, to hear with you and Amanda, and also I like to say that the work that you are doing in Cine Limite is wonderful on Brazilian cinema. And you mentioned Cinemateca Brasileira at the beginning, and I'd like to say some words about that, because it's very difficult to see what's happening with Cinemateca Brasileira. And when it comes to silent cinema in Recife, many things are held at Cinemateca. All the nitrates are at Cinemateca Brasileira. The collection, the Pedro Lima collection with many documents is there. And all those materials, they need people, they need specialized workers to preserve them. So it's extremely sad and revolting to see what's happening. How the films are. They need everyday care. So we are throwing away our history, and those films, they are not dead materials. They are so alive because we are discussing them all the time. So they have so many things to say to us, and so many things to be investigating and researched. And it's a situation. It's unbearable, really, and along with the materials from Recife, many others are now at risk.
Thank you, Luciana.
So
Amanda, please.
I want to thank you too for inviting and congratulate you, because I think it's a great opportunity to know this production of the Recife Cycle, of this production that's available, thinking about the sad situation of the Cinemateca Brasileira. And we have a little bit of hope when we see the work of Cinemateca Pernambucana, when we have this active preservation mode, and those films are 300 films available for watching and to know part of this history. There are not only films, but other kind of materials are integrate the archive of the Cinemateca Pernambucana. Most of them are contemporary works, like screenplays and a lot of clothes and a lot of art objects. And it was really special for me when we were at the University of Reading, seeing Pernambucan films there, discussing Pernambucan films, and now to see Pernambucan films in New York and seen by people of all of the world. It's really special.
So once again, thank you both for really beautiful final statements there. I think my big takeaway of this conversation is how much there still is to discover. And while both of you were so knowledgeable about these topics, it's also so exciting to hear people who have really spent their lives studying these topics to feel that there's still so much more to learn about the Recife Cycle, and of course Pernambucan cinema more broadly. So that's my really big takeaway. I agree with Amanda as well that regional archives in Brazil are so important, and it's so important that film can be preserved not in one central place, but really its memory and its life can be found in different places throughout Brazil. And the Cinemateca Pernambucana is an incredible resource, and it's been extremely special for Cine Limite to put on this program, to translate the films. The program's about to end, so I do want to thank the translators, also Gustavo Menezes, Mateus Pestana, Jaime Oliveira, who translated 10 films pretty much for this program, and it's been really special for us. So I want to thank you both for your time tonight, for your thoughts, for your ideas, and I hope this conversation can continue in different formats and different ways. And I'm also, Amanda, really excited to learn about your secret discovery. And I think everyone listening, or everyone listening who will be listening in the future, will be keeping posted on that. So good luck with that. And I think I'll end the conversation here. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll have more live events such as this one in the future. Okay, everyone.
Thank you very much, William. Bye.